Dr. Harmse holds, for those of you who don't know, a PhD in economics, and his predominant sort of area has been in that specific field, where he's been a professor for the University of Pretoria for many, many years. And between 2001 and 2006, he was actually the head of the Investment and Trade Policy Center for the University of Pretoria. And they did multiple research, training work on African trade and investment issues. And I think that his copious experience speaks for itself. We've even got one of his past students, doctoral students, on with us. And he was also, during the period, he was the chairperson of the Northern Gauteng division of the Economic, let me see if I get this right, Economic Society of South Africa, ESA, and a member of the Central Council. I think once Dr. Harmse left academic life in 2006 and became a consultant, he's worked for various asset management companies, but he's certainly not given up his absolute passion for academics. And he's still an extraordinary professor in economics. Well, he was for the University of Pretoria till 2013, and he continues to be a part-time visiting lecturer at multiple institutions. He's also a little bit of a celebrity in our midst because he writes a weekly column on the South African markets for the Independent News Group. It is indeed an honor, Dr. Harmse, to have you with us this evening, and we really look forward to you sharing some of your insights with us and sort of, you know, where we currently stand, etc. So I hand over to you now, Dr. Harmse.
Marla, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. You know, when I and Harvey had a talk last week, you know, I've said to him that I talked 2 Mondays ago with the foreign mission candidates and ambassadors on exactly the same topic on economic realities, pre and post COVID-19, and I think it is a topic that will lead to a lot of research. So I'm only going to share a few ideas and facts today, and of course we can talk about it, and please stop me as I go along. Now I know you know, the audience is vast, from students that had economics as a subject years ago to Professor Reiter. So Professor Reiter, I'm not going to talk about regression analysis and panel data on this. That's a thing for another day. But what's very important is to look at what happened on economic philosophy and economic thinking over the last, I will say, the last 5 years. And it seems though, and that's my whole idea why I talk about economic realities, it seems that we're going to move anyway in a new dispensation of economic realities post-COVID. And it is only a situation that's been hastened now. I think we were anyway en route to a new economic dispensation and a new way of economic thinking, economic policies, and economic prospects going forward. What one has to realize is that it seems for me that since 2000, the world went into a new era of globalization. We all know that. And globalization brought through, of course, the third industrialized revolution, up to the social media that we have now, broke all borders between countries, and it quickened and it hastened the whole economic system. So the economic system did not become countries, it became the world. Even in Africa, like Marla said, in my early years of the 2000s, when we tried to look at a new dispensation for Africa and how Africa can be the new new economic union by 2030 through trade and investment, it was well known that economies will become more integrated, policies will become more freely, and we almost will move towards liberalization, not only of trade, but also liberalization of policy and government thinking towards a more new democratic dispensation going forward. We know that China at that stage was long out of the World Trade Organization. They didn't want to join it due to the fact of their trade policies. But more pressure was already being put on China in the years after the 2009 recession, so that countries came to the realization that we had rather have to work together than going apart. So after the banking crisis of 2009, things started to change. This is how I see that. This is how I see it. It seems though that after the big shock or the black swan of 2009, globalization was not longer anymore the golden word. The US started already 2014 and 15 looking at their bank sector, putting some stress test on their banks, stopping them banks, to become too more involved in globalized activities. We saw even the stock exchanges came up with some comprehensive rules and regulations. And it seems though that we were moving in a direction of less integration and more conservative protectionism. And it started to become more heated up about in 2016. So in 2016, as a background, we've realized that when President Trump took over, for him it was all about the US and the rest of the world to become second. So he started moving towards a less liberated economy, a more protectionist style of economy. And then, of course, he was joined by Britain, starting to argue about Brexit. So these two forces already start to appear in the economy of the world pre-COVID. The problem with globalization, as I can see it now, is that if you open the world economy to globalization, it becomes more and more market-related policies, and it is was if governments in their strive to be more, in inverted commas, democratically elected and act democratically, moved into the opposite situation. And especially in Africa and the Middle East, we realized that corruption and government interventions on a lot of areas became more and more violent. It also became more and more obvious. And it leads to, of course, a more and more poorer communities, especially in Eastern Africa, and then in the Middle East, in countries like Syria, etc. So the outcome was, of course, a huge outflow of people flocking to Europe to get away from governments that got involved more and more in corruption and state capture. So by 2017, we saw this huge influx of people moving into Europe. Now, Europe at that stage, of course, opened its back for refugees coming in, because once they're in, the European Union borders, of course, are open. So that led to the idea from Great Britain that they are not prepared to share that with the rest of the world, and that's why Brexit started to come to the forward. Now, the reason why I start this as an opening situation and then going to talk about in a direction that the world is moving now and that South Africa is moving, it is quite clear that pre-COVID, things started to become more risky in the world. I'm only going to mention the 3 risks. The first risk was that the US economy was in a process of outgrowing the rest of the world. Now, you can call it Trumpnomics, but what Trump did is through his more protectionism of his economy, he stimulated the economy to a big extent by cutting taxes, by making sure that he have an immigration policy to keep Americans in America, and also to stimulate the economy from the monetary side, in a sense that the US economy was in one of its biggest and highest economic growth upturns in the last 100 years, with an average economic growth rate reaching 3% plus per annum, with an inflation rate lower than 2%, with almost negative interest rates, and an unemployment rate coming from 10% in the Obama time to as low as 3.4% at the beginning of 2020. So one could argue, and a lot of people argue, on the economic side, Trump did what all Americans wanted him to do. But of course, in the process of immigration laws, in the process of attacking China, the Chinese-US trade relations started to impact a lot on the world and also on the emerging economies. So just before the Wuhan situation, we've seen that the US-China trade war had a far more negative effect on the rest of the world than between those countries themselves. The third risk that we had just before the COVID virus, of course, was the whole story about instability in Europe, with various prime ministers trying to get Brexit up and going. And then when Mr. Johnson took over, it seems though that he became the strong power, even stronger than the rest of Europe. So by the beginning of 2020, it seems though that Britain also sent out a message to the rest of the world: we rather have more protection than less protection. This globalization is not going to work. And these noises also, of course, have flown over to countries like even Germany and France. So by the end of 2019, with the Wuhan trade lockdown in China, a lot of countries were not aware of what would be the effect at the end of February, beginning of March. The last risk that we had just before the reality, before the COVID-19 a pandemic lockdown from a global side, was the fear that the US economy will go into a recession, but due to the fact that they will go into a recession due to a big increase in interest rates, the US economy would be overrated. Their markets, their stock markets were on record levels on a daily basis in January and February. And also the problem that the US economy would undergo a huge correction, just like they did in 2009 with the subprime crisis. The banking sector would give away in a new flood of uncertainty about the US financial system. Interest rates will start to rise, and by the end of 2020, the US will go into a recession the same manner as in 2009, where inflation will start to become a really problem. So that was the thinking at the beginning of the year. And what is also important is that domestically, South Africa himself moved into a huge volatile movement due to the global situation. Now, back at home, we had our own problems. This economy could not grow. What's very important here is that the South African economy, in fact, went into a recession pre-2020 3 times in the last 4 years. And the main reason for that was that if you look at the various, presidents that we had, we've realized that economic policy in South Africa was at a panobetus for about 12 years. If you look at the various presidents of South Africa after 1992, under the Mandela era, we had a stage of transition from apartheid to a new democratic dispensation. Sanctions were, of course, abolished. We've abolished the financial rand and a commercial rand, and we had a huge inflow of portfolio capital in the 90s. And we restructured the Reserve Bank, and we restructured state finance. We had Minister Gordon as head of SARS, and a very strong team at the Reserve Bank when Tito Mboweni took over in the middle of the 90s. And Minister Trevor Manuel started with his growth, employment and redistribution strategy on the table in 1998 to 1999. It was supposed to be a 4-year strategy to get the South African economy structure correct. And under that structure meant bringing back the high government debt that they got from the previous government, also to make sure that there's a transition towards more black economic empowerment, and of course also to make sure that the South African government introduced policies of trade liberalization and a market-oriented type of state policy and state governance. So by 2002, the South African economy reached an economic growth rate of more than 4%. The inflation rate came down dramatically from in the 20% to less than 6% in the targets. The rand-dollar exchange rate came down dramatically from rates of almost 16, 17 rand a dollar to less than 7 rands a dollar in the middle of the 2000s. South Africa's debt remains below 25% of GDP. And in fact, in 2 years, we had a surplus on both the current account of the balance of payments, as well as a surplus on government expenditure, where expenditure was less than tax income. So we had a surplus on our budget. So that was the idea. Of course, the left side of politics didn't like this, because they thought distribution of income would have moved far quicker, and that the transformation of the economy towards a more inclusive economy would have happened
quicker. So let us call it the left side of the ANC then, of course, took over in 2005, 2006 with the then head of the youth brigade in South Africa, what's his name is now? Julius Malema. At Polokwane, they got rid of Thabo Mbeki, and the Zuma era started. Now, the Zuma era started, of course, and we have to say that with the National Development Program. Now, we have studied the National Development Program at length at the University of Pretoria as well as the Bureau of Market Research. There's nothing wrong with that program, but that program never was implemented. I still need evidence that that program was in fact implemented. It have changed names, it have changed strategies over the last 10, 15 years. And all that happened is that government just started to take a bigger part in the economy. After 2009, after we saw the world recession, right? Government expenditure just kept going at a rate of real terms of 3 to 4% per annum. So the economy couldn't grow at rates more than 2 to 3%. And all that happened is that government became the only big employer of people in South Africa. They became basically an employer agency. So they became all bigger and bigger, and government debt started to increase. So by 2020, we had a few problems. The economy was for the third time moving into a recession in 3 years. Of course, helped by the big drought that we had in 2018 and the mining sector growing in 2000 negative quite extensively. The mining sector contributed extensively to negative economic growth rates as the mining sector contracted by 12 to 13% in 2018, and together with the horticultural sector, we moved into recession at the beginning of 2019. At the meantime, we had the state-owned enterprises making use of all the surplus tax income from South Africa, and even more, receiving between 60 and 80 billion rands as a bailout annually since 2017 to 2020. It's reckoned that the South African Airways on itself received 80 billion over the last 4 to 5 years. With 80 billion, we can let all our students study for free. We can, of course, make sure that all primary school infrastructure and secondary school infrastructure are on a high standard. And we could also make sure that we could build almost the backlog on houses with the same money. So we had a dire straits effect at the beginning of 2020.
So what I hear from you is there's enough energy in the system to make it an economic viable system. There's enough action that can be taken to make the socioeconomic context work. If we can just make appropriate decisions, or if we can make decisions that's directed towards a different aim. So in my mind, then the question is, what is the economic reality? Because I almost sense, you know, it's like a family. I grew up in a poor family. Now, the economic reality of a poor family with parents that are not educated to direct or maneuver through the rapids is disastrous. So it's not that the neighbors who were in a similar context were experiencing the same dire straits that I may have experienced. We were actually in a similar context. But the only thing that was different is the people who made the decisions. So is it then fair to say that you're arguing that the context is a reality, it is what it is, but how we respond towards a context is probably the more critical factor in economic terms? Because I don't want to get depressed because of where we are economically now. Because I want to believe if we all put our brains together and we all, our energy go in the same direction, in a similar direction for the greater good, this economy would, in a matter of time, make it 6 months, would look different. Matia has proven that to us in Malaysia from the 1960s. Singapore has proven that to us similarly over the past 30 years. The Scandinavian countries has proven that in the last 80 years. Because the Scandinavian countries are still in a dire situation. They've got a lot of climate factors against them, but yet they are making it economically to be successful. So my question to you as an economist, you the economist, is what is the buttons that we are not pressing, that we should press to change this around?
You look at those countries, Malaysia and those countries, how did they do it? They went through trade liberalization, trade. They used the globalization at that stage. They also introduced more and more private sector enterprises.
Yeah.
Using the energy of that as incentives to trade, make profits, and to create jobs. It's well known that in the Malaysian situation, of course, backed by government, 100%.
Yes.
Creating the environment, the cost of doing business in those countries were almost as low as you can get. Opening, of course, trade in the area, intra-Asian trade, those type of things. In other words, stopping all the breaks in the system. And that's what we don't have. The cost of doing business in Africa is from the highest in the world. Right? To getting a business started in South Africa, it's almost impossible. There's no incentives for them to do that. The labor unions, unfortunately, still hit all the buttons. If you just look at the South African Airways, and the billions of rands that we have to pay over to state-owned enterprises that are corrupt, pushing up all costs for people to doing business in South Africa. So in other words, we need a new dispensation, and the president calls it starting with investment in infrastructure and small business development. But we have to, 100%, we have to start again. Because we have to turn, if you can see my screen, we have to turn this thing around. Of unemployment going up, economic growth going down, government debt moving towards 100% of GDP, and downgrading by almost all of the institutions of the grading agencies in the world, due to the fact that the South African government is at this stage not willing to make sure that the buttons are pushed, that this economy can start to grow again via private sector and individual businesses going forward. Let me give you an example. If I were the Minister of Finance now, I would say the following. All people that start a new business with a turnaround of less than 10 million per year in the first 10 years
who do not pay taxes or VAT at all and will have no cost of starting the business, with the only exception that they have to register as long as those businesses operate in the townships and in the rural areas. That's one example. Because people now say, but you can't do that. How can you give people a tax honeymoon and a VAT honeymoon? The government is not going to get any income out of this. I can tell you the government's income will increase far more than we thought. Yeah. Because the moment that you get those activities going into these rural areas going, and small business will come to the forward, and they will create jobs, people will start to earn an income. That's a typical economic system.
Yeah.
And the tax income from VAT and the other activities in that would be far more. So that's only one example that we have to do, because we have to make sure that, you know, that we stop this madness of public debt levels. If you look at our public debt to GDP and the growth rate, it is madness. And at this stage, the problem that we still had when COVID-19 came along, South Africa had a problem. We have over 700 state-owned enterprises. Look at this cartoon, it's the best that I've ever seen. The number one said we must keep working hard so that the economy can grow, and this is just a question that you asked. And chaps, as the number one said, we must keep taking money from the chaps who keep working hard so that the economy can grow. Look at the difference. So it's a mindset that we have to change. Private over state-owned enterprises. So what's going to happen here is that Pravin Gordhan is going to win this fight. And what's going to happen is that Minister Tito Mboweni will have to take 10 billion somewhere from someone else and reallocate that money to the new South African Airways, right? Because he cannot go and borrow more money. So somewhere along the line, this thing is getting bigger and bigger and skewer and skewer. Why? Because the private incentive is not there. We don't have that buttons to give the incentives to businesses to do what they have to do. Now, the biggest problem that we've had back at home, the fact that we're in a recession again, we know, our unemployment is high. And surprise, surprise, this afternoon, our unemployment rate came out on 23%. And I thought, wow, I expected 40%. But you know what happened? 2 million people. 2 million people didn't even look for jobs anymore. So in other words, your so-called people that's outside the definition of the labor market increased by, the discouraged workers increased by 2 million in the second quarter. So they're not part of the labor force anymore. So suddenly the unemployment rate is down. But if you look at the discouraged workers in South Africa, they are now in the vicinity of about 6 million. So if you add that to it, we know that our unemployment rate is more than 50%. So how do you turn that around? You're 100% correct. Because our debt levels already, before the budget, was moving in the direction of 70%. And the tax base is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. Only 4.5 million people contribute towards paying taxes. So the problem that we have is that we've introduced a program, the coronavirus program of 500 billion rand. And I want to show you a cartoon that was drawn exactly 2 days after the president, announced the COVID program. This was, as you can see, the 26th of April. This was the 26th of April. And at that stage, nobody thought that this would have happened, where that 500 billion stimulus program is being stolen away, is being captured. So that the government had to acknowledge that. So we're 100% correct. We need a new dispensation going along. But the biggest problem of the post-COVID in South Africa is the recession tsunami that's coming. The recession tsunami that's coming. People reckon that 200,000 people this year will die due to malnutrition, against the 16,000, 17,000 people that died with the coronavirus. Right? The lockdown was again like in previous policies. We looked at the best policies of the developed world and we would like to, to just copy it onto South Africa. And that didn't help. it was a madness to keep this economy as closed as we had for so long. So the recession is going to be far more harmful to this economy than the virus itself. The latest estimate is a minus 10% growth this year. Now, how are we going to get out of that? You see, that's another problem. And I would like to go over to the discussion. The fact that we had a 15.1% growth rate at the end of the first quarter, 70% year on year. But I want us to discuss and talk about the big debate. And now, thank you for that question already. I think we've set the tone there already. The first thing is, how do we get this economy growing? I just gave a few examples. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of other thoughts, even more. Right, so how are we going to get this economy growing? How are we going to decrease government debt? Because if we're not going to decrease government debt, foreign direct investment will not come into this country. Portfolio capital anyway will flow out. The rand will stay under pressure. Right. And then lastly, how will we create jobs? Because these are the three questions that we had to answer in the next 4 to 5 years. How are we going to get this economy to grow again? How are we going to decrease government debt? And how are we going to create jobs? Because the after effect of the coronavirus was as if the South African economy was on a cliff. The coronavirus just pushed us over the cliff. But we were already heading towards falling over the cliff. The coronavirus just pushed us over the cliff. Okay, so without a very big academic economic analysis, it's quite clear. This economy is in a recession and going to remain in a recession for long. We will be downgraded to junk for years to come. Right. It will be that the government seems to protect state-owned enterprises. They're going to keep on with them, even though they are inefficient. Right. And it also seems that there is no policy towards creating jobs as we go forward. Putting that on the table, I think we can discuss that. That was what I would have brought to the table this afternoon. That South Africa went from bad to worse, to even worse in the last 2 to 3 years. And the political infighting in South Africa will continue over the next year or two. And it seems though that the Commission on State Capture is now the latest target. Right, that the Zondo Commission is now the latest target. Everyone else is right and he's wrong. That's a debate that's going to heat it up in the next 4 to 5 months, when the Zondo Commission have to finish its work by the middle of next year. What's going to happen with all those evidence in front of the committee? What are we going to do with all that billions of rands that have been stolen? The latest one is the one in the Free State, and everything that's coming out now. So how are we going to turn around that energy into making sure that South Africa moved back to the years of the beginning of the 2000s, where there was a commitment by government, where there was a commitment by big business to make sure that investment expenditure and sound economic policies were put on the table. So this is where I would like to stop. This was only a few ideas that I would have liked to share you how I see this, number one, as a market economist, and two, as an academic economist.
Okay, so I see Lebohang's got a question there asking, is it possible to reset the economy and start afresh?
I think that's the only way to go. We have to reset it, right? We have to reboot this economy. And the way that we're going to reboot this economy is that at NETLAC, the roles of government, private sector and labor unions must be spelled out. Because we cannot reboot this economy and start without taking those 3 decision groups with us. The labor unions, private sector and the government. So they had to put clear policies on the table. And, you know, our economists already have spoken and asked for a economic endowment of a week, where all the role players come together. We can open it on television. We need an economic endowment, where we put everything on the table and say, all right, how are we going to reset this economy? But we need to do that. If we're not going to do that, we're going to just carry on like we carry on now. With every budget, right? The priorities of everyone would be higher, and government debt will just increase more and more and more. Private sector will start to play a smaller role, and unemployment will just increase. So we have to reset this economy as quickly as we can.
Lebo, I see you've said especially the labor unions. Do you want to comment further?
Thank you, Mala. I think the biggest problem we have in our country, and people don't want to discuss it on the table, as Doctor was saying now, that we need to have an economic in-depth, which is very important. And I think what we need to do is to slash out all the labor unions, because they are affecting everything. See, the problem is not the administration as such. The problem that we have in the country is politicians being involved in the administration side, which makes everything difficult, because they have due influence in everything. And most of the influence also comes from the labor unions. Thank you, man.
Party and government is the same. And I think that's our problem. In a lot of other countries, you get professional administrators. Right, they are in charge of administration of government departments, and they are not necessarily political related. And I think it's so intervened with the labor unions, and we definitely would have to look at that situation.
And then,
Mr. Aita?
Yes, thank you, Prof. Harmse. Yes, for that incisive presentation. I think for me, it's just a comment, or probably maybe to add to what you said. And I think it's related to Lebohang, that we need to reset the economy and start afresh. And I think if you look at what has been happening, the downgrades and all that, because of the ever-rising debt, I think the main problem in South Africa, or with the South African economy, is that you have an economy that is not growing. Now, when you look at debt to GDP ratio, so you have the debt that is a numerator, and the economic, or the GDP, that is a denominator. We are not doing much to the denominator in order to stabilize the government debt. Because I think if you look at, even if the economy of South Africa was to just grow even by 2%, you will see that debt will stabilize. And I think that will be able to keep the rating agencies comfortable. You see, now you look at GDP, it is going down. Because it's going down, to GDP ratio will keep rising. It is ultimately economic growth that will actually help us to make, or to stabilize the debt and generate the much needed jobs. That's where now restarting the economy afresh, grow the economy, ensure that we do something to the denominator and stabilize that. That is just something that I wanted to add to what you said.
Thank you, Prof. I think I've put that slide on sharing. You can see since 2010 the way that these two went in opposite direction of growth versus debt, and I think that's the crux of the situation.
Chris, I want to ask, in line with the previous question. I'm concerned about the population, or the society at large. It's almost, if I have a sense that not enough people realize how important it is that we should all literally get up and do a better job. That we must recalibrate how we think of the economic reality. As much as I appreciate the technical comments about GDP and growth and ratios and cost of sales and all those financial terms, and as much as they are important to us, that maybe in this discussion, for the man on the street, these things mean nothing. So how do we get the mind of the individual to start believing that they have and I have a contribution that must be made? So how do we get up on a different direction than just waiting for another policy or another growth initiative or another guiding from whoever outside? I'm worried that we're not thinking of how do we utilize or mobilize the energies of people at grassroots level. And I want to come back again, unfortunately, where one comes from. When we were poor, my mum and dad did extra things. We worked in gardens. We prepared vegetables. We stood on the street. We sold them. Now, those things may sound insignificant, but the reality was we took charge of our own economic reality. So how do we get more people to take charge of the economic reality in going forward? So I'm almost worried that we are waiting for some big brother or sister, as we sometimes see, that says, don't worry, like certain political movements in the country currently saying, don't worry, we will be your guardian, we will look after you. How do we move that energy? And in your experience, what are some things that you can point society to and say, what must be done at a grassroots level?
I think what's very important, and I agree with you, is how are we going to market opportunities? I know that Hungary started with that. What Hungary did is that in each little town, they open what they call a economic hub desk, and they did it in most of their literally in the town halls. You could apply for a business there. If you need someone to work in your garden, like you say, you can go there and get someone. And government officials and private sector people who work there, especially over weekends and during the evenings, for free. And apparently, you can get a business, you can get a license to a business within an hour or two. There are some of the other European, the so-called Eastern European economies that's moving in the right direction. How are we going to sell, yes, opportunities for people to go forward? Look at Jerusalem. Look at that song. That's one idea. One guy that had it in his mind. He took the opportunity to develop that. And that's why I say, if we give the opportunities in the rural areas and in the townships for people to just take their opportunities on their own. But then, of course, we must make sure that government support them on all levels. We must make sure that these opportunities are widely, being made available. And that's why in such an Indaba, economic Indaba, we need people from grassroots levels. We need the youth. We need a whole area of people, and through social media, even people on school level is better in social media than we ever wish to be. So you're 100% correct. How are you going to market South Africa? When I talked to that missions, the ambassadors 2 weeks ago, the one ambassador asked me, now, how do I market South Africa overseas? I've got nothing. I literally got nothing to market my country. And I realized that this guy is frustrated. And I think we have to market opportunities on grassroots level. You're 100% correct. the two theses that I did now for Da Vinci, in fact, went back to the traditional system in Zimbabwe and in Nigeria. I said, what can communities do, learning from tradition over years, to get the economy started in Zimbabwe? And remember, they are far more dire straits than we are. So they started their own schools, they started their own businesses by making bricks, right, and bringing in IT development. So they're using now the old so-called traditional economic system, what worked for years in that area of Zimbabwe. So you're 100% correct. It's time that we go back and say, what energy can we get? I'm sure there's a lot of traditional systems in the rural areas of South Africa where entrepreneurial opportunities are there. Now, the two models that these two gentlemen used is the narrative model of reborning of traditional systems in rural areas, in Nigeria as well as in Zimbabwe. And maybe we should go back to that. Go back to the roots, like you said, when you grew up.
So I see Brian says reset the economy in special economic zones that are really special, labor laws relaxed, etc. The role of macroeconomics.
The idea which has come out is that we have a need to reset the economy. I think that's important, but the question is, how on earth do we do that? The civil servants will not agree to a zero-based budget for fiscal expenditure. That's one of the things that we need to do, but it's going to be very difficult to implement, to have a zero-based budget for government expenditure. What we can do, though, is create special economic zones, rather like the Chinese did, where in a particular region, there's a complete ability to reset the economy. You don't have any regulations. Your labor laws are completely relaxed. There's no exchange control. I'd like Dr. Harmse to comment on the merits of setting up a series of special economic zones, which are really special. Not at the moment, we do have special economic zones, but they're not particularly special. I'd like Dr. Harmse to comment on the merits of this as a way to reset the economy in small sections, and then we can see what works using experimental economics.
No, you're 100% correct, Brian. I remember when I did my PhD thesis in the 90s, I created an efficiency model for the South African economy based on the East Asian experience. And in that model, that was very related to the growth, employment, and redistribution policy that Trevor Manuel had. We talked about economic processing zones. And that's why those countries were so successful. In that economic processing zones, of course, there are no regulations on those companies, no tariffs, no minimum wages, no labor unions. So it is competition and exports. Why do we have to export our gold and our platinum to the rest of the world without the beneficiation of that? Those type of things that we have to talk about. And I think from another remark here from Sir Anthony, that say that economic challenges of Africa is the fact that the public sector wage bill and hefty budget deficit is a problem. It's a tragic inequality. So there is a huge need to change that. Now, number one, will the government have the guts to impose zero budgeting and stop the wage bill increasing? Stop the employment of only the public sector. So we would have to make sure that the next budget is almost a no debt budget. Going to be very difficult. And the fact that we will have to make sure that
the public sector would realize, you know, that if you want a job, you're not necessarily going to get it in the public sector itself. Now, the budget deficit can only be brought down, one, if we do something with state-owned enterprises as quickly as we can. If we have to privatize them, we will have to privatize them. If the Western Cape can get into the grid fully in the next year or two, let them do that. If there's a lot of companies in South Africa that they reckon that they can that they can put Gauteng also on the grid through private sector initiatives in the next 2 to 3 years, we don't need a South African Airlines, right? If the SAB, South African Broadcast Association, SABC, is not up to scratch, then get rid of it. So it's not only the state, the state salary bill, it's also the state-owned enterprises that are inefficient. If you're not going to do away with that, how are we going to make sure that just more and more of tax income will go into state-owned enterprises that is inefficient, and that they create just more and more and more jobs due to the stronghold that the labor unions have on them. You see, so these are all the things that in the economic Indaba we will have to address. But the big thing now is, will this president and this Minister of Finance have the guts in next year's budget to accept only a zero budget and cut the salary bill? They reckon there is between 30 and 40,000 jobs that will have to be cut immediately if we want to make a dent into government debt. Why will have all these departments? At one stage we only had 16 or 17 state departments. Now it's in the vicinity of about 70 ministers and deputy ministers, all those things. But surely we will have to start making sure that we move in a direction where labor unions and government plays a smaller role, and the rest of us have to take opportunities.
Thank you for your discussion. I think this being our first online curiosity, but most importantly, I think that it's really important for us to stay connected, to stay co-creating, to continue to not only connect, but collect the dots with each other. And really that is the purpose of curiosity, is to think beyond just what we speak of as Da Vinci, as the 9 dots. Those of you familiar with our 9 dots will know. But it is about seeing things beyond what is just in front of our eyes. So thank you so much. We recognize how precious time is and how pressurized time is in an environment now where we are often going to basically be, where we're often in an environment where time actually has become more precious to us. So thank you so much. Prof. Klopper, I hand it over to you now to close our session off, please.
I want to thank everybody here this afternoon. As you pointed out, Marla, it was a precious time, but I think it was an important debate. We start opening it up. We have this discourse, and we hopefully will deepen this. And a word of thanks to you, Gibson. I think what you shared with us is very interesting. We will be monitoring your study and looking closely how you progress it. And I think it's definitely a valuable contribution that you will make. And to anybody in the audience, if there's support or guidance or suggestions to Gibson, you're welcome to do so. You can facilitate that through me or engage with Gibson directly. Because I think Gibson, as you now midway through your study, moving to the end, you and your supervisor, it's always valuable to test your ideas and, to scrutinize it amongst a safe environment in scholars like this afternoon. So thank you for that. And I think what you have shared with us is very exciting. And as you were speaking, I reminded myself when I did my own studies, not that long ago, but also not that far away, was wanting to nurture those memories. It's important what you do. And sometimes it's lonely, but don't lose faith. And you're on the right track. And then to Chris, thank you very much for also being here this afternoon and sharing your insight. I think there was a lot of words of wisdom. You gave us a few challenges. I think that's important for us. that we need to go back, nurture that, rethink that, and use that as lenses to look at life differently, and ask ourselves what as we as individuals can do, what as we as Da Vincians, what can we do in our communities if we start somewhere and just make a little difference day by day. I like to believe very soon, and Ben, you've mentioned 6 months to maybe a year in the future, we will be there. And I think that's really a noble and also an honest and a challenge that we must take up. We'll be watching the economy, and hopefully, you know, people will start take note of what you and your fellow economists are saying. And I value the input from the floor also to Professor Aita. I think if we have these discussions more and more in future, by lensing and looking at our challenges differently and through new, fresh eyes, sometimes just being reminded about the reality, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because we must never be naive. We must always be open-minded, positive, and ready to take on a challenge. So much appreciated. And from our side, as Da Vinci, we have a little token, and it's a small piece of something that will make you curious. Would like to touch base with you afterwards and ask you how did you experience this, but we much appreciate it and value the input, and also to everybody here, and Marlon for also facilitating the questions. And I know it was the first time online and there was a few challenges here and there, but I think in the end we did accomplish, and we had an open discussion, and I think that was for me and on behalf of the others very valuable. Thank you to everybody here this afternoon.